This Alabama farmer stood alone in court, mocked for how he talked. 30 seconds later, his words left the judge and the internet speechless. Vernon Tate wasn't nervous. Not really. He stood there in courtroom 3B of the Mobile County Courthouse, wearing the same faded denim shirt he'd worn to church 2 days earlier. His palms weren't sweaty. His hands, in fact, were dry and rough from decades of tilling, repairing, and coaxing life out of a stubborn patch of Alabama soil. The room was quiet as he cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began, looking directly at Judge Patricia Kline. "I'm here 'cause that new pipeline's taken water from my south field." And that's when it happened. The chuckle. A low, breathy sound slipped out of the judge's mouth, not loud enough to interrupt, but sharp enough to cut. Her lips curled in amusement, and her eyes flicked toward the court reporter as if to say, "Did you hear how he said that?" "Irrigation," Vernon had said, with his thick drawl dragging across every vowel. The judge tilted her head, still smiling. "You mean irrigation, Mr. Tate?" she corrected, her voice laced with the kind of tone people use when reading to toddlers. There was a short pause. Vernon didn't flinch. "Yes, ma'am," he replied evenly. "That's what I said." A soft murmur moved through the courtroom gallery. Not loud, but not silence either. One woman shifted in her seat. A man in the back cleared his throat. The bailiff stood a little straighter. Patricia Kline had been a judge for over 2 decades. She'd handled murder trials, land disputes, custody battles, and in her mind, a water rights hearing between a black farmer and a local contractor didn't exactly scream headline material. But something about Vernon's tone caught her off guard. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't meek. He just was. She leaned forward, still with that patronizing smile. "Well, Mr. Tate, if you could state your complaint again, clearly this time." Vernon inhaled slowly, not because he was angry, but because he knew this part of the game. He'd seen this smile before, at banks, at zoning meetings, even at farm supply stores when he used a term wrong. It wasn't new. "I've been working the same land my granddaddy cleared by hand," he said. "We ain't asking for favors, just water. Enough to keep our crops alive like we done for 60 years. The lawyer for the contractor, a slick-haired man named Blake Donovan, stood to object. "Your Honor, we'd prefer to stick to the legal specifics of the complaint." "I am sticking to specifics," Vernon said, without looking at him. "That pipe got laid across county lines without so much as a notice. They rerouted a stream that fed our irrigation pumps, and now we're paying for trucks to bring in water that should be ours." Patricia blinked. She hadn't expected him to come prepared. She glanced at the clerk, who was flipping through the filed papers. Vernon took a folded document out of his coat pocket. "This here's a copy of the letter I sent to County Utilities back in March. Never got a response. Got a signed receipt, though." He handed it to the bailiff, who walked it up to the bench. Patricia looked at it, then back at Vernon. She didn't smile this time. But Vernon wasn't done. He looked straight ahead, voice steady. "Your Honor, I know how I sound, and I know how folks hear it. But I ain't here to entertain no one. I'm here to speak on land I was born on, worked on, and watched my daddy be buried on." A hush fell over the room. The judge shifted in her seat. You could almost hear people holding their breath. Vernon glanced at the gallery, then back at the judge. "May I finish what I came here to say?" Patricia didn't answer right away. Her eyes were darting. From the courtroom to the file, back to Vernon, then briefly to her own reflection in the brass plate on her bench. She nodded, not with a smile, just a nod. And the room settled again. But Vernon's next words would do more than just settle the room. They would shift everything. Most folks in that courtroom didn't know Vernon Tate beyond the way he spoke. They saw a weathered man in boots older than some of their cars, a man with a slow drawl and mud still caked on the back hem of his jeans. But none of them knew what it took to survive 3 generations on Alabama farmland, land that didn't just feed his family, but raised them. Back in Wilcox County, about an hour and a half northwest of Mobile, everybody knew the Tate farm. It sat on 84 acres of rough red dirt and stubborn clay, broken up by fields of soybeans, rotating patches of okra, and the same 24 pecan trees Vernon's grandfather planted by hand in 1937. The farm didn't look fancy. No new trucks, no shiny signs. But every inch of it was earned. Vernon grew up watching his father fix engines with a socket wrench in one hand and a Bible in the other. His mother ran a small produce stand off Route 10 that stayed open even on the hottest days, and she never once let a hungry neighbor leave empty-handed. They never talked much about dreams in Vernon's house, not because they didn't have any, but because there was no time to sit around and fantasize. The work had to get done. The cows had to be fed. The field lines had to be checked. And even now, at 58, Vernon did all of it himself. Not because he didn't want help, but because too many of the younger ones had left for the city. He wasn't bitter, just realistic. The thing was, water had always been a fight. Vernon remembered the summer of 88 when the pumps stopped pulling anything from the creek for nearly a month. He and his father had loaded barrels of water into the bed of their old Ford, driving back and forth every day just to keep the crops alive. No one helped them then either. So when this contractor, Baldwin Land and Drainage, came out of nowhere and rerouted a stream that had quietly fed their farm for generations, Vernon didn't grab a sign. He didn't shout. He documented. He measured. He asked questions. And when no one answered, he filed his claim. "I ain't asking for no charity," he told the clerk the day he dropped off the paperwork. "Just a fair shake." He could have hired a lawyer. But after a few phone calls and consultations, where he kept getting told the case wasn't winnable, Vernon figured it wasn't worth wasting his savings on someone who didn't believe in the fight. So he stood in court alone, not because he wanted to, but because sometimes it's better to speak for yourself, even if your voice shakes, even if they laugh. People thought the case was about water. It wasn't. Not really. It was about being erased again. Because when that pipe was laid, no one knocked on Vernon's door. No one asked permission. No one told him his field would dry out. And when he tried to call, he was rerouted 6 times before someone hung up on him. In rural counties, especially when you're black, you learn real quick that some complaints just float off into the air, like dust behind a truck. That's why Vernon brought his folder with him to court. Newspaper clippings, old survey maps, handwritten letters from his father, even photographs of his children standing next to the pecan trees back in 1990. Not because the judge asked for them, but because he didn't want anyone saying he didn't come prepared. Back in the courtroom, as Vernon adjusted his stance and held eye contact with the bench, people began to look at him differently. This wasn't some stubborn old farmer wasting the court's time. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why it mattered. But the truth he was about to share next wasn't just about his land. It was about every man who's ever had to prove his worth twice just to be heard once. Vernon didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The courtroom, once casual and half bored, now leaned in. Even Blake Donovan, the contractor's lawyer, sat up straighter, his confidence starting to crack around the edges. Vernon held the room, not with force, but with the kind of presence you only earn after years of being ignored. "May I finish?" Vernon asked again, his eyes steady on Judge Kline. She gave a tight nod. No interruption this time. He unfolded a worn piece of paper from his folder. Not legal documentation. Something older. Lighter. A letter, yellowed at the edges. He held it gently. "This here," Vernon began, "is a letter my daddy wrote to my granddaddy in 1962. He was 18, had just come back from helping out some farmers down in Jackson. They were losing land 'cause some developer rerouted a creek without asking anybody. He wrote home saying he didn't understand how people could take from folks who work the ground, then call it progress." The judge shifted slightly in her seat. "He told my granddaddy, 'Don't ever stop speaking up, even if your voice don't sound right to them.'" He paused, folding the letter back up with care. "That's why I'm standing here today, Judge. Not just for the water. for what it means when a man like me is expected to sit quiet while someone takes something that's his. No one said a word. Not even the clerk typing in the corner. Vernon pointed gently toward the stack of reports the county had ignored. I measured every gallon we lost. I can tell you the days the crops turned yellow. I can show you the receipts for water delivery trucks we had to pay for ourselves. You want to talk numbers? I got numbers. He wasn't angry. He was hurt. Not because someone messed up, but because they didn't think it mattered enough to ask, to notify, to consider. They expected Vernon would shrug and adjust. They always did. Blake Donovan cleared his throat. Your Honor, while we sympathize with Mr. Tate's situation, his emotional testimony— It ain't emotional, Vernon said, eyes never leaving the judge. It's factual. My field's dry, the water's gone, and my crops are dying. That ain't emotion. That's business. That's survival. There it was again. The shift. Not loud, not dramatic, but the way Judge Kline's jaw clenched, the way she rubbed her temple with the edge of her finger, said everything. Something in her cracked. Maybe it was the letter. Maybe it was the quiet steadiness in Vernon's voice. Or maybe it was the growing awareness that the courtroom was watching. Not just with eyes, but with phones. A teenager in the back, seated beside her mother, had quietly tapped record on her phone. Not to be disrespectful, but because she could feel it. Something real was happening. Something worth remembering. Vernon took one last step forward. I ain't a lawyer. I ain't got no degree. But I know my land. And I know when I'm being dismissed before I even finish my sentence. You smiled, Your Honor, when I said irrigation. I ain't mad about that. I've seen worse, heard worse. But if a man's going to be laughed at for how he talks, how's he ever supposed to be taken serious when it counts? You could have heard the ceiling fan click. Kline looked down. She wasn't writing. Just sitting there. Quiet. Blake tried again. Your Honor, if we could bring this back to legal standing— We never left it, Vernon said. You just didn't expect me to know where I was standing. A woman near the front, older, white, maybe late 60s, let out the smallest of agreement. The room was tilting. The power was shifting. Not because Vernon demanded it, but because he earned it. Word by word, fact by fact. Kline finally spoke, this time softer. We'll recess for 10 minutes, she said. The gavel hit. Vernon didn't move. He looked over at the gallery, not with pride, not with bitterness, but with the weight of someone who knew this fight didn't start today, and sure as hell wouldn't end here. But outside those courtroom doors, something had already started, and it was growing faster than anyone inside could see. The hallway outside courtroom 3B was buzzing, but Patricia Kline sat still in her chambers. The courtroom coffee on her desk had gone cold. She wasn't sipping it anyway. Her eyes were locked on the closed laptop in front of her, her hand frozen halfway to her pen. She wasn't new to this job. Far from it. She'd been on the bench longer than many of the people who walked into her courtroom had been alive. 23 years of rulings, trials, mediations, and yes, her share of public pushback. But this felt different. That man, Vernon Tate, hadn't yelled. He hadn't accused her of racism or demanded special treatment. He hadn't cried or lost control. That's what made it hard to dismiss. He had simply looked her in the eye and told her exactly what had been taken from him. And the worst part? She had laughed. She didn't mean it maliciously. At least she told herself she didn't. It was a reflex, one that came from 1,000 little moments in her life, where she'd been taught, quietly, subtly, that some voices were more refined than others. Voices like Vernon's, they were often treated as background noise, colorful, folksy, uneducated. But not today. Not in her courtroom. Not with those people watching. She'd seen the teenager with the phone, the mother trying to pretend not to notice. Even the court clerk had hesitated longer than usual before resuming her typing. Judge Kline reached into the drawer and pulled out a sticky note with her personal court motto, scribbled in fading ink. Listen twice before deciding once. She stared at it. She'd written it in her first year on the bench, right after mishandling a property case involving a Korean couple whose translator had been late. She still remembered the embarrassment and the headlines. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. It buzzed again. Finally, she looked. A text from her niece. "Aunt Trish, you're going viral on TikTok right now. Just saw a clip. Please be careful what you say in that courtroom." Her chest tightened. She clicked open her browser. She shouldn't have. But she did. The clip had already been viewed 37,000 times, and it had only been posted 20 minutes earlier. The caption read, "Judge laughs at black farmer's accent. Then he does this." She watched herself on screen. The smile, the correction, the smugness. Then Vernon's calm reply. His story, the letter, the crowd reacting. It was all there. Raw, unfiltered. She closed the tab. For the first time in years, Patricia Kline felt something she didn't often allow room for in her work. Shame. It wasn't about being caught. It was about knowing she had become ethically the kind of judge she once promised herself she wouldn't. Back in her early years, she believed in nuance. She believed in context. She listened. But somewhere between re-election campaigns and calendar backlogs, that muscle had atrophied. Vernon had reactivated it in less than 5 minutes. She reached for her pen and wrote in the margins of the case folder, "Review County Code on Stream Diversion. Research Tate Property Rights, 1946 present." She paused, then added, "Revisit tone in handling." Outside the door, her clerk knocked gently. "Your Honor, court resumes in 2. Kline stood, straightened her blazer, and looked in the mirror above the coat rack. She smoothed her hair and practiced a neutral expression. But something in her eyes had changed. She knew what she had to do now, not because she was worried about backlash, but because she finally understood the weight of Vernon's words, not just as a legal argument, but as a generational one. When she stepped back into courtroom 3B, Vernon was already seated. He didn't look at her right away. He was flipping through his papers, calm, unshaken. She took her place. "Mr. Tate," she said after a pause, her voice more grounded now, "thank you for your patience." He met her eyes. This time there was no smirk, just silence, respectful, but charged. But before she could continue, someone else was about to make this courtroom much bigger than any of them could have imagined. By the time Judge Kline returned to the bench and gave Vernon the floor again, the clip of their earlier exchange had already crossed state lines. In a cafe in Baton Rouge, a retired teacher showed it to her husband between bites of peach pie. In Nashville, a group of college students passed it around during a late-night study break, pausing every few seconds to shake their heads or whisper, "Damn!" And in St. Louis, a civil rights attorney forwarded it to her network with a single line. "This one matters. The algorithm had done its job." And now the story wasn't just about Vernon and a water pipe. It was about dignity, about who gets heard, about how quickly a single smile can cut deeper than a gavel ever could. Back in the courthouse, the gallery had grown. Word had spread, not fast, but wide. Some people had driven over during lunch just to see if it was real. Others just wanted to be there in case something else happened. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a need to witness. Something about Vernon's calm presence, his refusal to shrink, had made people want to stand near him. Court resumed, but the energy was different now. Even Blake Donovan could feel it. His usual courtroom swagger had dulled. His hands fidgeted under the table as he whispered to his associate. His client, a corporate rep from Baldwin Land and Drainage, stared straight ahead, visibly tense. Kline opened her mouth, maybe to move the case forward, but was interrupted by her clerk, who stepped up quietly and handed her a note. She read it, eyes flicking up in surprise. A national news outlet had just called requesting a statement. She looked toward Vernon, who was now sitting calmly, waiting. "Mr. Tate," she began slowly, "before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge that this hearing has drawn significant attention." Vernon blinked, then gave a small nod. "That's so." It appears a video of our earlier exchange was recorded and shared online. It's circulating quite widely. I figured someone was holding a phone," Vernon said. "Didn't know folks would care much, though," Kline exhaled. "They do." There was a pause. Then Vernon said simply, "Maybe 'cause it ain't about me. Maybe it's about what happens to folks like me every day when no one's watching. No anger, just truth." Kline glanced toward the gallery, then down at her notes. "We'll allow your full statement to be entered into record, without interruption." "Appreciate it," Vernon said. And just like that, he stood again. No podium, no theatrics, just the same man, the same voice, this time carrying 1,000 more behind it. "I don't want nothing extra," he began. "Just what's fair. Just what the law says I'm due." He laid out his records again. Water charts, dated photographs of cracked soil, the delivery invoices, the letters he'd sent. Each detail painted a picture, not of victimhood, but of persistence. As he spoke, a young reporter stood in the back, scribbling notes. She'd driven 2 hours from Biloxi after seeing the video. She wasn't assigned the case. She just knew it meant something. Her pen didn't stop once. Outside, a local TV van had pulled up, and by that evening, Vernon's name would trend on Twitter, not because he demanded it, but because he represented something. He wasn't polished, he wasn't famous, he didn't give a fiery speech, but he showed what quiet strength looked like when met with disregard, and how quickly things can shift when people really listen. That night, the clip would reach 1.4 million views. Comment sections filled up with stories, people remembering the times their accents were mocked, the times they were talked over, the jobs they didn't get, the landlords who never called back, the bank officers who lost the paperwork. And Vernon Tate, the man who came to court alone, became a symbol, not because he wanted to be, but because truth, when spoken plainly and without fear, has a way of catching fire. But the case itself wasn't over, and what happened when Vernon walked back into that courtroom the next morning would leave everyone stunned. The courthouse looked different the next morning, not physically, same brown brick walls, same uneven tiles near the front steps. But there was a heaviness in the air, a quiet anticipation that hadn't been there before. A local pastor stood by the entrance, nodding greetings to people filing in. A group of university students had set up folding chairs outside, holding signs that read, "Let him speak," and "Water is life." Inside, Vernon Tate walked through the metal detector just like he had the day before. But this time, the deputy didn't rush him through. This time, someone opened the door for him. He wore the same denim shirt. No need to dress different. The truth didn't change overnight. Courtroom 3B was packed, not with cameras or media, though a few were seated quietly in the back, but with neighbors, strangers, people who saw something in Vernon that reminded them of their fathers, their grandmothers, themselves. Judge Kline sat at the bench, already in place when Vernon entered. Her expression wasn't soft, but it wasn't hard either. It was something else, focused. She adjusted her glasses and tapped the gavel once. "This court will now resume the hearing regarding the Tate v. Baldwin land and drainage matter," Vernon stood. Blake Donovan leaned toward his client, whispering urgently. They hadn't expected this kind of attention. They thought it'd be a routine case, a clean win. But now, their client's name was being whispered in grocery stores and reposted under clips titled, "Farmer Shuts Down Judge with Class." Kline began, her tone steady. "Mr. Tate, you presented documentation yesterday regarding the unauthorized diversion of water from your property. I've reviewed your materials and the county's infrastructure records from 1983 onward." She glanced toward Blake. "Mr. Donovan, do you have any formal rebuttal prepared?" Blake rose, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, we maintain that all work done by Baldwin Land and Drainage was within their contractual rights. The stream in question wasn't mapped under Mr. Tate's property line at the time of construction." Vernon lifted a worn map. "'Cause the county didn't update them. That stream's been running the same way since my granddaddy was 16. Just 'cause the ink says one thing, don't mean the land moved." The judge held out her hand. "Let me see that map, Mr. Tate." He walked it to the front. Hands steady. She compared it to the official document from the utilities office. Quiet filled the room like a thick blanket. Her eyes scanned the two maps, line by line. Then she looked up. "Mr. Tate," she said, "your documentation appears consistent with older records. And more importantly, it shows a failure on the part of the county to notify you of construction that directly impacted your farm." There was a rustle in the gallery, restrained, but hopeful. "As such," Kline continued, "this court finds that Baldwin Land and Drainage acted outside of procedural boundaries and failed to obtain proper easement approvals. Mr. Tate, you are entitled to compensation for documented water losses, and the company is ordered to restore access to the stream within 30 days. No cheers, no applause, just silence. Then Vernon exhaled. Not loudly, not theatrically. Just the quiet release of someone who had carried something heavy for too long. Blake tried to protest, but the judge raised her hand. "You may file an appeal. But for now, this ruling stands." She looked at Vernon again, not from above, but from across. "Mr. Tate," she said, "I also want to address something else." The room held still. "I reacted poorly yesterday. My words and my tone were not appropriate for this bench or for anyone coming before it in good faith. I'm sorry." Vernon nodded once. Not smug, not triumphant. "Thank you, Your Honor. That was all." Outside, as he walked through the crowd, some folks tried to pat him on the back. Others just stood quietly, eyes wet, holding their own stories in their chests. Vernon didn't make a speech. He didn't take selfies. He walked down the courthouse steps and got in his truck. Because there were fields still waiting. But what he left behind wasn't just a ruling. It was a reminder that speaking plainly, even when laughed at, can still move walls. The truck door creaked the way it always had. Vernon sat behind the wheel, not rushing to start the engine. He took a breath, hand resting on the gear shift, eyes on the courthouse behind him. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a symbol, or a story, or a headline. He felt tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The other kind. The kind that comes from holding your tongue too many times in rooms where your presence was tolerated, but not welcomed. The kind that builds up when you know your truth before you even speak, but you still have to prove it from scratch. He turned the key, and the engine hummed to life, but he didn't drive away just yet. Down the steps came a woman, same one who'd let out that quiet the day before. She walked toward his truck, cautious, hands folded in front of her. "You don't know me," she said through the window. "But I grew up near where your farm is. My daddy used to buy your mama's okra." Vernon looked at her for a second, then smiled slightly. "That so?" "Yeah," she nodded. "I was in court yesterday. And today, I just wanted to say, it mattered, what you said." He didn't say thank you. He just gave a small nod. She stepped back. "Take care of that land. Always have," Vernon replied. She walked away. He drove off. Later that day, a news crew tried to find him. They drove out toward Wilcox County, stopped at a gas station, asked around. Nobody pointed them toward the farm. Not because they didn't know, but because Vernon didn't need cameras in his face. What needed to be said had already been said. Back in Mobile, Judge Kline sat in her office long after court had ended. She'd declined all interview requests. She didn't need to clarify her side. There wasn't another side. She'd messed up. Her apology didn't erase that. But maybe, just maybe, it planted something. That night, she opened her inbox and found dozens of messages. Some critical, sure, but many were thoughtful, honest. People sharing their own stories of being dismissed, of being corrected, of being talked down to because their words didn't come out with polish. She read every one, and for the first time in years she responded. Not with a copy-pasted line, with real sentences. Because Vernon hadn't just won a case, he'd pulled back a curtain, made people stop, listen, rethink, not just the system, themselves. The clip of Vernon speaking was now at 3.2 million views. It had been translated into subtitles in 6 languages. A teacher in Des Moines used it in her civics class. A barbershop in Tulsa replayed it on a loop. A group of veterans in Mississippi printed out part of his quote and stuck it to the wall next to their coffee pot. "You just didn't expect me to know where I was standing." That line stuck. Because it wasn't just about Vernon. It was about everybody who's ever had to prove they belong in a room they already earned the right to be in. A week later, Vernon got a letter in the mail. No return address. Just his name, written carefully. Inside was a short note. "My father used to say, 'Speak like the ground knows your name.' You did, thank you." No signature. He placed it in the same folder where he kept his daddy's old letter, the one from 1962, and then he went back to work. Because the soil still needed turning. Because crops don't care about hashtags. Because respect, the real kind, isn't about applause. It's about being heard, and then choosing to keep going anyway. If this story moved you, think about who in your life might be fighting a quiet battle no one sees. Listen before you judge. Speak up when it matters. And if you're still standing, keep standing. Subscribe for more stories like this, real people, real voices, and the moments that shift everything.